In today's discussion, we will concentrate on a particular aspect of M.N. Roy's political career. It is known by the Lenin-Roy debate, the debate between the undisputed leader of the world communist movement of that time, V.I. Lenin, and a young communist, Manovendranath Roy, over what is known as the national colonial question. The importance of the debate lies in two facts. First of all, it helped establish M.N. Roy in the international communist hierarchy as an ideologue. Though ultimately he fell out with the Comintern leaders and finally was expelled by the Comintern, but it helped to bring him into the focus of the communist movement at the international level in the early 20th century. And secondly, this debate, which took place for the first time on such an international platform, ultimately led to a more serious question, more fundamental question regarding center-periphery relationship, which not only engaged the attention of the communist thinkers and ideologues of the early 20th century, but also led to the development of an intellectual tradition in the post-Second World War era, in which we find many important thinkers talking on the same principle, on the same line. To start discussing in detail the debate between Lenin and Roy, first of all, a few factual details should be in order, I think. First of all, the time. The Second Congress of the Communist International was held in Petrograd and Moscow in the then Soviet Union between July 19th and August 7th, 1920. It was 2 years after the First World War, which ended in 1918, and 3 years after Soviet Union, the first socialist state in the world, was created, and it was the Second Congress of the Communist International. The first Congress of the Communist International was held in 1919. The Second International was dominated mainly by socialist parties and socialist thinkers of all hues, and the communists found it difficult to continue working with them, so they had to come out and form the Third International, in the Second Congress of which, held in 1920, the national colonial question was discussed in detail in threadbare fashion. Now, what does it mean actually, the national colonial question? Now, the First World War was labeled by Lenin as a war between the imperialist powers for the spoils of empire building. So, colony formation had started long before that, and the First World War was a war between how much to share over the share of the colonies between leading imperialist powers like England, France, Germany, and the European theatre. Now, on the other hand, in the colonies, in the far-flung colonies, which are definitely, as you all know, on the non-European soil in Asia, mainly in Asia and Africa, the people in the colonies were getting restive, and there was a fledgling and in some cases slightly developed movement for national liberation going on in different colonies. Movement not yet coming into the stage of a revolutionary upheaval, but people are rising up against the colonial rule, against colonial exploitation. So there was in Europe, on the European soil, a great war has just ended, and in the far-flung colonies, there are rising discontent and gathering movements of people of these colonies against the colonial rule. So this was a time when communists found it highly important to address the issue as to how the organization of the communists all over the world, that is the Communist International, how Communist International should look at these movements going on in the colonies, how it should, where it should take its position vis-a-vis the movements going on there, and what should be its tactical line. So almost the entire discussions of this Second Congress were devoted to this question, which is known as the national colonial question. Now, Lenin had prepared a thesis on this issue long before the second Congress was convened. And he found it necessary that there should be a point of view coming from the colonies. And in this context, I'd like to quote from an article by Sudipto Kobiraj. Kobiraj writes, and I quote, "On the eve of the second Congress of the Comintern, Lenin invited Roy to prepare a draft thesis on the colonial question besides Lenin's own, as Lenin felt he was unfamiliar with the concrete political situation in the colonies. The perspective Roy advanced in his draft thesis was, however, in important respects different from Lenin's. Surely, Roy's thesis too applied the conceptual apparatus of Marxist political economy, but his judgments on political question were vastly different. I repeat, his judgments on political question were vastly different. And this difference, or these differences, between Lenin's thesis and Roy's thesis led to what is known in common parlance as the Lenin-Roy debate on the national colonial question. What then were the issues that beget such different opinions between Lenin and Roy? We shouldn't forget at this juncture that Lenin, there couldn't be any comparison actually between Lenin and Roy, even as communist ideologues. Now, Lenin was the founder of the Soviet Union, the main force behind the formation of the Third International, and its undisputed leader, and almost the sole inheritor of the legacy of Marxian ideology. And locking polemical horns with him on the other side was Manobendranath Roy, the self-exiled Indian communist, who along with his wife Evelyn were delegates of the Communist Party of Mexico to the Second Congress. It was almost a David and Goliath-like confrontation on the ideological plane. And we should also not forget that Roy here, in his alternative or supplementary thesis, would be speaking mainly on India and not on the Communist Party of Mexico, which he was representing, and also to some extent on China. Let's look into the three main issues which concerned or around which the entire debate was revolving or used to revolve at that time. The first question was the level of economic development in the colonies. For Lenin and for any Marxist theoretician, and for every possible political movement, an identification of the stage of revolution is very important. Unless you can identify the stage of revolution, no one can, or no Marxist would, try to identify who or which class or which combination of classes were for the revolution and which were against the revolution, with which the revolutionary classes can ally itself with, and with which it must confront. Now, Lenin found that on the international level, there is a primary contradiction of imperialism between the oppressor countries, the colonizers, and the oppressed countries, the colonies. In the oppressor countries, were all European countries, the mode of production was entirely capitalistic, in which the main contradiction was between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. And the proletariat will have to transform the society through a socialist revolution as per the Marxist historical materialist considerations. In the colonies, the mode of production was mainly pre-capitalist. And being pre-capitalist, the state of revolution couldn't be socialist. It had to be, first of all, a democratic revolution led usually by the national bourgeoisie, though not necessarily by the national bourgeoisie. Lenin also recognized, Lenin found it from his readings, that in countries like India and China, a proletariat was slowly emerging, but not much of a force it was there. On the other hand, Maravendra Roy was the opinion that following or around the time of the First World War, Britain was rapidly industrializing India. They are building up an industrial network in India itself. Prior to that, Britain was exporting finished goods from the British soil to the Indian markets. But the British colonial powers and the British capitalist interests, they found cheap labor in India as well as cheap natural resources. So they shifted their industries to India. And as a result, there is a growth of industrial working class in India, which very quickly or in a very short time, according to Roy, became almost 5 million strong working force. And this working force, though on mainly economic grounds, were resorting to various kinds of movements. They were getting organized, and there are even cases of quite widespread strike movements. From all of which, Roy came to the conclusion that this emerging proletariat in India, it's emerging and rapidly growing proletariat in India, had become a quite fighting force, and it is no longer a pre-capitalist economy in India. It has converted itself into a capitalist economy in which the main contention, the main class contention was between the bourgeoisie on the one hand and the rising working class on the other hand. So it had to be a socialist revolution, which is quite distinct from what Lenin had prescribed, which was that it could only be a democratic revolution leading to a future socialist revolution. So that is the first point of difference between Lenin and Roy. The second point of difference concerned what role the national bourgeoisie plays in relation to imperialism. According to Lenin, when he identified the mode of production in colonies to be pre-capitalist, the leading power, the leading force in such a society was the indigenous bourgeoisie, the local bourgeoisie. They had money, they had capital, they were educated, their social standing, and they were the leading force, which could and which usually led the movement against the metropolitan bourgeoisie or the bourgeoisie from the colonizing countries. Now, they wanted independence. The national bourgeoisie wanted independence for their own development, for their development, self-development, which they thought was being hampered by the colonizing bourgeoisie, the metropolitan bourgeoisie. So they started a kind of movement for independence, for liberation. But at the same time, Lenin was quite clear that one should not confuse between the class aim of the national bourgeoisie and the class aim of the fledgling or the rising industrial working class. And these two class objectives could not be the same. The national bourgeoisie was bent on controlling the national economy, along with it the national political system, while the industrial working class was concerned with their own class interests, forming a classless society, leading to a socialist society, and capturing the power on behalf of the working class. So there was a kind of both what we call in Marxist terminology, kind of unity and struggle of the opposites. The national bourgeoisie and the local proletariat were at the same time united in their fight against the colonizing bourgeoisie, and in other places against each other, for their class objectives, class goals were radically different. Now, what to do about it? We'll come to that in the next section. But Roy, at least so far as India was concerned, could not accept Lenin's idea that Indian bourgeoisie had a dual character. And he was of the firm opinion that there was a clear case of class polarization between these two classes, the national bourgeoisie and the Indian working class, and they are not at all collaborating with each other, and their aims were totally in confrontation between each other. The third issue, which a part of the debate, around which the debate revolved, was an assessment of the revolutionary potential in the colonies. How far the colonies were really revolutionary, or how far the revolution was developing in the colonies, and with it, what position the Communist International and the Communist parties under it should take in relation to this revolutionary situation. Lenin's position was that there is an early phase of this national democratic movement in which the national bourgeoisie was leading a revolutionary movement, a liberation movement against the colonizing force, against the colonial powers. In this early phase, the national bourgeoisie was fighting against all sorts of pre-capitalist forces, reactionary, obscurantist, reformist, religious-minded, superstitious. They're trying to bring about an end to all these forces which held back the development of society on the capitalist path. And to the extent it was fighting against those reactionary and backward-looking forces, it was playing some kind of a progressive role. And as long as it was playing that much progressive role, the communists everywhere should support the national bourgeoisie of the colonies in their struggle against the colonial powers. But the moment the national bourgeoisie stops playing this role, the earlier or the previous forces stand defeated. It turns itself against the rising working class. And at that point of time, they should not be supported by any communist party. The Comintern, according to Lenin, should enter into a temporary alliance with the bourgeois democratic forces in the colonies. A temporary alliance, but should not merge with it. On the other hand, Roy was clearly against any kind of temporary or permanent alliance of the communists with the local bourgeoisie or the national bourgeoisie. To him, this class, the national bourgeoisie, was a totally reactionary class, and they should not be supported by either the Comintern or the communist parties individually. On the other hand, both the Comintern and its member communist parties should actively help in building up communist movement in India, so that it can embark on its program of socialist revolution for really liberating India from all sorts of exploiting forces. So these are three main issues on which the debate between Lenin and Roy revolved in the Second Congress of the Communist International in 1920. So this is what appears clearly before the eyes, but what went behind the scene was more interesting in that sense. Now, if we just go by the proceedings of the Second Congress of the Communist International, we find the pride of place being given to Lenin for placing his thesis on the national colonial question. So there was an intense debate at the committee level before the theses were actually presented on the floor of the Second Congress. And we'd find from all the data available to us through various documents, both official and non-official, that almost all the points raised by Manavendra Roy, which went against Lenin's observation, were deleted, while a very small portion of Lenin's observation was deleted at Roy's insistence. A few quotations, I think, will bring this out. Allow me to quote. It would be a mistake to assume that the bourgeois nationalist movement expresses sentiment, stand, and aspirations of the general population. The Communist International must not find in them the media through which revolutionary movement in colonies should be helped. And this was in clear contradiction of Lenin's standpoint, and I quote Lenin, "All the communist parties must assist the bourgeois democratic liberation movement in these colonial countries. The Communist International must enter into a temporary alliance with the bourgeois democracy in colonial and backward countries." And for this reason, Lenin deleted all the above passages from Roy's supplementary thesis before they are put before the Congress. But Roy, on the other hand, fought unsuccessfully for deletion of those points in Lenin's thesis which he found to be unacceptable. The problem was that, in this sense, that first of all, the two personalities, which I just mentioned in passing. The personality-wise, or as far as the standing in the communist hierarchy of that time went, Roy could not hold a candle to Lenin. Roy is a youngster in his 30s, a delegate from the Communist Party of Mexico, speaking about a country which had left voluntarily long ago. And to some extent, actually, Roy had a very exaggerated idea about the growth of proletariat forces in India too. Naturally, Lenin's idea held on the center stage and not Roy's ideas. But the fact that Roy was allowed to put a supplementary thesis on these points was enough indication that Roy had something to say, something of real value to say in that sense. The second major point in which Roy and Lenin differed was that how much the relationship or what should be the attitude, let's say, of the British working class towards the Indian working class. Now, Roy observed that by producing enough resources in India through the exploitation of the Indian workers, through the exploitation of the cheap labor and cheap natural resources in Indian soil, Britain was producing enough surplus value in India, which it was exporting to its own country. And by that, it kept the workers in Britain happy. And thus, the workers in Britain found no reason why they should oppose colonialism, because they were happy. Now, on this point, Lenin differed. While Roy was of the opinion that all members of the British working class were kept happy by the concessions given by the British capitalist interests by using surplus value created in India through the exploitation of the Indian working class, Lenin was of the opinion that only a handful of the workers, which he called the labor aristocracy, was being helped by concessions given by the British colonial capitalist interests. So the Lenin's use of the word labor aristocracy was maintained, not Roy's ideas. Actually, the whole debate, if we ignore the nitty-gritties, the points, the polemics of the debate for the time being, and if we go into the core of the debate was basically centered around what is known as the center-periphery relationship. In the colonial era, there is a colonizing force, all of them European, and the Comintern was controlled and dominated by almost wholly European communist parties, leading to the charge that Comintern of that time was totally Eurocentric in its views. Now the debate was, who would liberate whom? Should a liberation of the entire exploited forces in the metropolitan country should take place first, and then this country, this liberated metropolitan country, its working class, its Communist Party, should help the colonies to liberate themselves. Or a revolution in the colonies towards an end of exploitation regime should help the workers in the metropolitan countries to liberate their own countries. The center taking the lead, or the periphery should take the lead. Marx, way back in 1869-1870, in his letter to Engels, was clearly in favor of the fact that the periphery must liberate itself first, and with that liberation would come the liberation of the center. Rumblings of this debate, which was taking place, in fact, from the late 19th century throughout the 20th century, was once again found in the post-Second World War period, after colonialism had given way to a neo-colonialism or a neo-colonialist economy. There's still the question of center and periphery. The peripheries in the previously colonized world were still being controlled by the center in the developed, advanced world of the West. And all the movements were usually taking place in the peripheries. And once again the question was raised, which was much earlier raised by Marx, later on replicated in the Lenin-Roy debate, that what should be the relationship? Should the center control the periphery, or the periphery control the center? In the period of colonialism, for colonial interests, the center controlled the periphery. In the period of revolution, who should liberate whom? The question remained. And the question still remains, but perhaps for the first time, for a short period of about a week or so, from July to early August of 1920, a very young communist from India, though he was then self-exiled in Mexico, representing the Communist Party of Mexico, Manobendranath Roy, had the courage, had the observation to stand up to Lenin, the undisputed leader of the communist movement of that time, and put forward his own position in contradistinction to Lenin, and thus there was the important Lenin-Roy debate.